53. 18th Century Gardens for Use or Delight. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the garden in British colonial North America has been developing, both how it has been changing over time and how it differs from colony to colony based on how different ones were founded. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that I come up with my episode order before I start the whole season, though I will shuttle things around a little as I learn things. This season is based on last season's order with a few changes and additions. With that in mind, I was rather amazed to find a strong connection between 18th century gardens and the spread of tea throughout the colonies. History's full of threads that way. But before we get into how gardens changed, I want to lay down a little history regarding how they were last century, so the changes stand out. We can skip over gardens in the early Jamestown settlement since, based on the scurvy, starvation, and food thievery, it's pretty clear there weren't any. And just start out in the New England colonial gardens as the first English gardening in the North American colonies. While the men of the early separatist colonies were largely ill-prepared for life on the wild frontier, the women of the colonies had a bit of a leg up. Even in city living, it was common to have a kitchen garden of some sort, so most of the women had experience tending at least herbs, a few vegetables, and possibly a fruit tree. Even so, the battles they would face, starting everything from seed and dealing with their own loose-running goats and soon pigs and cows, would test even the good wife. At this point, farming and gardening were seen as two separate activities, and were gendered. Men farmed and women gardened. Farms grew meat and grain, and the produce was often sold or bartered for money and supplies that could not be made on the farm. Gardens grew the fruits and vegetables and medicines that surrounded and supported dietary mainstays that came from the farm. The phrase, for use or for delight, is from one John Parkinson, an English garden authority of the 17th century who was pondering the existence and uses of gardens and how they were granted as a gift from God. The use of an or versus an and, I see as a language choice that illuminates a particular way of thinking about the world and how delight and utility were regarded as separate things. Different garden types throughout the 18th century North American colonies leads me to consider that some colonies leaned towards the coexistence of use and delight, while others regarded them as separate things, and separation, use or delight, was the only way order in the world could remain. It is clear that the colonial gardens of the 17th century were edge-to-edge utilitarian. Crops were mainly chosen for how much food they would produce, and the most food for the least space and effort. Hence the profusion of pumpkins, summer squash, beans, and corn, with interjections of English plants. I mean, if you're looking for bulk, anyone who has successfully grown zucchini can tell you about bulk. It may not taste the best all the time, but boy, oh boy, is there a lot of it. And no, the Pilgrims, despite having all the ingredients, were not making fried zucchini blossoms stuffed with herbed goat cheese. Between the religious convictions toward plainness and austerity and the sheer need for food, no thoughts of beauty or aesthetics entered into the garden layouts of the 17th century. Utility and food. Where was the sun? Where was the shade? What made for the right amount of drainage for this plant or that? Does this crop prefer to have wet feet or dry? Other than removing rocks, there was very little manipulation of the landscape or soil. That mostly had to do with the fact that there were just severe labor shortages. If a garden task wasn't about food, shelter, or paying off debts, it likely did not get done. Medicinal plants were grown, which often have pretty flowers, but that was incidental, and little or no artistry in the arrangement of the plants was considered. As the settlements that were part of kingly gifts in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania were inhabited, gardens as survival rather than enjoyment was still the guiding principle, even though more of a mercantile mindset was in play rather than a religiously ideological one. The soil type and direction of the slope, along with local food and medicinal needs, determined plant arrangement more than anything else. Even in South Carolina, which in the 17th century was more a colony of Barbados than of England, and was as much a retreat from the Caribbean as anything else, had to think utilitarian gardens rather than anything ornamental to simply set up housekeeping. North Carolina and Georgia were both more or less the wild frontier, so gardens there were also entirely about food and survival. The biggest differences at this point, as one went north to south, were in the varieties of bean and corn changing with the weather, and the large starchy vegetable of choice shifted from pumpkin to sweet potato. More English grains could be grown in Virginia and South than would thrive in New England, and a wider variety of medicinal plants were grown in southern gardens than those of the North, again because of climate. But for the most part, in the 17th century, a garden was about food and medicine, and realistically, the emphasis was on food. It was all for use. If anything, this is the time the garden inventories of the North and South will be the most similar, and mostly because they are all working from a limited selection of what they brought over and a very sparse use of the native flora beyond the food crops everyone grabbed up out of sheer survival. But enter the mad botanists. Once colonial North America and passenger shipping got just a bit stable, so things like town piers for loading goods and taverns for housing the mildly genteel explorer natural philosopher trunks full of paper, inks, pens, and brushes appeared. The cataloging of North American flora and fauna began in earnest. Since we're on the garden episode, just flora, the plant explorers, are the focus. The animal enthusiasts like John James Audubon and Alexander Wilson will have to wait. In the 17th century, the plants of interest that were sent back from North America were mainly things in the vein of valuable for economic development and exploitation. So items like sweet potatoes, corn, beans, cranberries, tobacco, and sassafras. Plants of aesthetic interest is what came out of the 18th century exploration. One of the most popular early discoveries was the tulip tree. This is a large shade tree that has flowers which resemble tulips, and while tulip madness had died down, the hunger for ornamental and unusual botanical specimens was alive and well in England and on the continent. Other new flowering and ornamental trees like azaleas, redbuds, and magnolias were shipped home to the novelty-hungry English gardeners. Over time, a wide and almost overwhelming list of flower cuttings, drawings, paintings, and seeds were sent back as possible candidates to enliven the ever-competitive English garden scene. Many were found to be finicky to grow in the English climate or didn't become favorites, though some did, and unless well documented, simply got rolled into the truly overwhelming catalog of flowers grown in 18th century English gardens. In fact, as plant and animal life from all over the globe was pouring into Europe as a consequence of the last few hundred years of exploration and plunder, a curious problem developed: how to know what to call a thing. Even if you knew it was that golden, precious, bark-covered fruit from the Caribbean with the spiky leaves, should it be recorded as ananas, abacaxi, piña, or pineapple? Or that starchy fruit all over the North American lands, pompion, seemling, kershaw, macaque, pumpkin, or squash? Something had to be done because things were getting confusing. Alphabetical order was no longer enough. There was simply too much data. How can we tell if we're talking about the same thing at all? Enter the orderly mind of a Swedish curate and botanist, one Carl Linnaeus. He started his career in organizing the natural world with plants in the 1730s. He had a definite knack for this work. He used observed similarities in plant types to categorize them. He went on to classify animals as well and did fairly well working within the limitations of the time. The binomial system he put into place has been adapted and enlarged for our modern world, so those pineapples, despite having all those names, were all Ananas camosus. And those squash, there are several species there, but they all live under the genus Cucurbita, and so can be sorted into varieties like Cucurbita or C. pepo, C. moscata, and C. maxima. The binomial naming system and setting up of categories for grouping things proved to be popular as scientists spoke to each other about specimens and helped root out duplications or the application of one name to more than one type of plant or animal. This helped speed up the sharing of knowledge about the natural world for better and worse. It created more curiosity and clearer ways to communicate knowledge, but it also fed the rush to identify chunks of the natural world for exploitation. In his later career, in the 1750s, due to external theological concerns as well as his own hubris, Linnaeus decided to divide and subdivide humanity, quite frankly accelerating some of the festering artificial racial divisions that were developing under the spread of European Christianity around the globe. Several of his decisions lay in his need for his classification system to fit humorism, the 4 temperaments, and the 4 associated colors, and laid the groundwork for some of the strife we live with even today. Okay, I'm getting off the topic of plants. We'll return to the mess Linnaeus made in the animal world when we talk about some 18th century animals. But I could not bring him up without pointing out that, like many men with a few good ideas, he tried to take things too far and made a giant mess other people are having to clean up far beyond his own time. But in the plant world, where he wasn't trying to shoehorn flowers into his worldview, Linnaeus did good work. And over the decades of the 18th century, his binomial classification scheme for plants was widely adopted. This made it easier for a transatlantic market for plant matter to develop and created a fashion for collecting, naming, and creating new hybrids of different plants. A common language to discuss plants expanded the popularity of their study. In Europe, during the 18th century, as science and classification of all things was becoming the rage, botanical gardens, greenhouses, and orangeries were planted in major capitals, in university towns, and on vast estates. As a result, more and more people could visit and become interested in and knowledgeable about more and more types of plants. As a result, a healthy transatlantic trade in plants developed, and with that interest, so did the early versions of garden centers. In the 17th century, it had been incumbent on each home, farm, community, or estate to save seeds and clippings for its own plants. By the 18th century, seeds, cuttings, rootstock, and other plant parts that could be used to grow new plants were to be found in commercial establishments. There was also a large amount of gifting and trading between scientific gentlemen, all interested in developing the best combination of plants for their interests, climates, and circumstances. In the New England colonies, there was the least trade in foreign and fancy flora. These colonies were most focused on utility as well as having the least hospitable growing conditions. So gardens in this area remained the most utilitarian and most likely to adopt local plants into them. Thus, any flowers they added to their gardens continued to be medicinal or native or both, such as the wild rose, still to be seen along the coastline and famously providing rose hips, another powerful anti-scorbutic to fend off scurvy on land or sea. Ornamental landscaping such as wide lawns, decorative stone follies, and artificially sculpted hills would not appear in this region until the late 19th century. New York, while English in name, was still very Dutch in its farms and gardens. From the beginning, growing an impressive variety of plant foods had been a goal and had been attained. The skills in horticulture, valued back in the Low Countries, had taken root, yes, I just said that, in the rich soils of the valley of the Hudson River. Garden favorites from Europe mixed with American produce, and unique varieties of apples and squash, along with a myriad of other vegetables and fruits, were to be found in the New York area. Beauty and function were allowed to intertwine, so food, medicine, and purely decorative flowers were all raised and flourished in the Dutch gardens. In fact, the tradition of the flower picture or painting was a specialty of Dutch painters. Creating floral arrangements to rival these idealized representations was the pride of many a New York gardener. Also hewing close to the European Dutch tradition was garden design, and the geometric and practical layouts remained popular in North America. In the mid-Atlantic colonies, where the weather was better and there was a kinder feeling towards commerce and connections to England, botanical gardens that both grew and distributed plant species were more common. One even still survives in Greater Philadelphia, John Bartram's Garden, which was established in 1728. One of the growing centers of commerce and population, as well as being a Quaker stronghold, orderliness and adherence to tradition were strong design forces in the Philadelphia garden scene. The The design sensibilities of the large and successful German farming population also likely contributed to trend towards orderliness and regularity. As a result, kitchen gardens and food gardens continued in the designs determined to be the most sensible in the last century. Also, each garden tended to follow prescriptions for arrangement of paths and types of plants to have, again leaning on the kitchen garden essentials, including fruit trees brought over from England and other parts of Europe, as well as the sensible corn, bean, and squash additions of the New World. Also by the 18th century, hot peppers, or cayennes as they were often known, would be grown in sunny corners. This form of spicing food had been imported from the Caribbean by the enslaved cooks and free blacks that would produce the soon-to-be famous Philadelphia pepper pot. The cayenne was a much more dependable and attainable source of spiciness than the sinfully expensive black pepper. As Philadelphia built its merchant class from both legal British shipped goods and the cargoes of curious provenance from Brazil, Curacao, and other parts of the Caribbean and beyond, great houses and great estates with noble flourishes such as deer parks and formal gardens were being built. The first decorative rather than functional landscapes designed to European standards were arriving in North America, and the preferred style and arrangement was of the 17th century formal garden style, with tight geometric and symmetrical designs. The ornamental gardens resembled the mazes and knots popular in palace gardens and genteel homes. However, the types of flowers were often of greater variety. Here the trees, shrubs, and flowers of North America would be mixed with European favorites as well as new exotics brought back from China and other parts of East and South Asia as auxiliary cargo with the tea and spices. The seed catalogues of the time were produced to imitate the Dutch style of flower painting to tempt the aspiring gardener. In both the gardens of New England that were utilitarian extensions of the farm, and the New York and Mid-Atlantic family-size farms that might grow grain or livestock for export, but also had separate kitchen gardens that were intermingled sources of food and pleasure, for the most part, farm and garden labor was done in both of these places by a combination of family members, indentured servants, and paid laborers. Both men and women were expected to take part in work. There were a few gendered jobs, fewer women doing farm work except during harvest time when it was all hands on deck, and fewer men working in food preparation. North Carolina was still the wild frontier at this point, largely due to the Outer Banks islands making it hard to develop an export-facing shipping economy, and Georgia at this point had made the keeping of slaves illegal, as it was supposed to be a combination penal colony and location where men might farm to rehabilitate their characters. So gardens in these places were much more in the manner of the frontier farms of the last century or the smaller family-run farms of New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. However, in the colonies that were largely composed of gifts of large tracts of lands from the king, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, also started sprouting decorative gardens alongside the sensible home and kitchen gardens, along with South Carolina, where its richest members hailed from Barbados or were French Huguenot refugees. All these colonies, while also market-minded, had lighter ties to a religious sense of orderliness. Instead, the latest fashions were more likely to influence garden construction. In all these areas, the cities were smaller. Instead of living close together to watch over shipping fortunes, plantations tended to be spread out along the courses of navigable rivers, for that was how people got their products to market and received new goods. This meant instead of being in the foment of ideas of either the New England villages or growing mid-Atlantic port cities, each plantation was a small, isolated factory town unto itself. In these plantations, gardens took on two different identities. There were practical gardens for growing food, and then there were gardens purely for pleasure. These southern colonies had large chunks carved out and were given to one proprietor or another, or had been purchased by someone looking to farm a cash crop, usually tobacco, specifically to make money, not to create a new country. The farm part on the plantations, as in other colonies, was typically run to make a certain amount of money. But here the money-making was less in the selling locally, as with Pennsylvania wheat and barley or mid-Atlantic cheese, but rather in growing cash crops to be sold in England or globally. At this point, that meant mainly tobacco, rice, and indigo. Food farming was also done on the property to provide for the plantation, so some grain crops, orchards, and beans. The rest of the food crops, including melons, squash, tomatoes, okra, lettuces, cabbages, coleworts, carrots, and radishes, along with the herbs, medicinal, and culinary, would be grown in working food gardens. And these, like the plantation farm fields, would be tended by the enslaved. Outdoor work on these parts of the properties were not seen as fit work for white women. In fact, it was in this era that the Southern mythology of fragile womanhood was crystallized. While women's indoor and outdoor labor in the kitchen and field had been essential to setting the colonies up on their feet, suddenly it became the fashion to remove women of a certain wealth and position from the pool of eligible outdoor laborers. Among many other things, this change in philosophy gave birth to the 18th century style of pleasure garden in North America. In the medieval and early modern periods in Europe, segregation by sex in large establishments was common, and outside of the servant classes was fairly strictly enforced, so female-only spaces were often created by the creation of walled gardens. Similar conventions were reestablished on large farms and plantations, though instead of building as many stone walls, landscaping was often used instead, paths and tree arbors, and the composition of growing spaces. This desire to create hidden and separate spaces, along with the new art coming from China, on the same ships as the tea, influenced the design of these grand, decorative gardens. The money-making acres on the farm, for the most part, remained functional and largely geometric, but the studied, artfully designed, artificial nature of Chinese gardens and landscapes was trickling into English sensibilities. Just as they had developed their own version of ceremonies for serving tea, the English of the home island and on the great money-making estates of the Caribbean and the southeastern colonies developed their own version of the garden scenes they were seeing on Chinese painted scrolls and imported porcelain. The geometric and symmetrical garden designs of the 17th century were discarded in favor of a curated depiction of nature, where hills and ponds and arbors were placed to create boundaries and spaces. These would then be decorated with plants from around the globe to create levels, textures, and moods. Women could work on these gardens because they were art, and to have a family member dedicated to producing things of no utilitarian value whatsoever, in fact consuming money and labor in their pursuit, was definitely a demonstration of power. It is from some of these 18th century ideas about gardens that some of the design elements of the 20th century American suburban home arose, as well as a certain number of Home Ownership Association, or HOA, bylaws, and even some city ordinances. By the 18th century, it was well established that lawns, as opposed to pastures, were a ludicrous use of time and space for nothing but display. So, of course, possession of a tended piece of planted ground that only consumed and did not produce was sought after and envied. And producing the image that one did not work outdoors except on a hobby or leisure activity became an aspiration, especially for women. Fast forward to the suburban home. Lawns and flower beds or floral borders in the front of houses became the default position. In some towns and housing developments, it's a requirement. Gardens, on the other hand, are relegated to the side or the rear of houses. For a long time, using a garden as an actual necessary food source, especially in the suburbs or cities, was considered somewhere between strange and a scandal. I mean, sure, some novelty tomatoes were fine, but using a home garden as a primary source of food, that was a country or rural thing to do. The placement of the garden to the side and back meant all the working in the garden was to be hidden from the street. Starting in the 1980s, the idea of a suburban food garden in the front yard started to appear, including a garden that would produce a significant amount of food. Cities and HOAs would even make rules, and there would be a lot of neighbor fighting over such unorthodox use of where the front lawn or shrubberies should be. In the 21st century, a partly utilitarian front yard garden has now become its own show of power or capability, that one has the time and resources to produce such a thing. While for others, removing as many growing things as possible, hardscaping has become another option. Recognizing that they don't have the time or resources to give to keep growing things within human preferred aesthetics, whichever ones have been chosen. This is a funny circle in history to consider. So what was in gardens in the 18th century? How they were arranged, or whether they were for use or delight, or both, depended heavily on what sort of colony they were in and the wealth of the owner. Gardens that were self-contained, practical, globe-trotting, or showpieces and displays of wealth and power all existed. The transitional nature of the colonies and their differing opinions regarding the home country was reflected in the wide varieties of purposes gardens were put to. Next week, we'll continue in the realm of growing fancy things for fancy people. It will be Orange Week. In the 18th century, all anyone in the West had access to was bitter oranges. But they have sugar, so many things happen. I will be advocating for more orange flower water in our foods, and while I'm at it, a definition of marmalade is needed, since it feels like everything is getting marmaladed these days. Thanks for listening. Just a heads up to everyone, I may have to go back to the every other week schedule for the month of August. I'm trying to get ahead. I should be able to let you know next episode. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. This is where I'm working to get up pictures, links, and interesting media I consumed for the episode. Questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com, as well as on Twitter, where I'm most active. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help this show become more visible to the wide world out there. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at THOA Food and in the show description.